Well, Michael, today in this talk, I am very pleased to welcome one of the heavyweights of American politics. Your CV is quite huge. I'm really sorry if I forget some tips. Speechwriter of former President George Herbert Walker Bush, 1988-1992. The co-founder and leader of the Tea Party movement, by far the greatest political movement in U.S. history. He is a regular conservative commentator, political analyst and strategist. He's a regular guest in CBS, MSNBC, Fox News. With us today, and very welcome again, sir, Michael Jones.
Thank you, Carol. Good to be with you.
Thank you, sir. My understanding is that you were born in Pennsylvania. Am I right?
That's right.
You were born in...
I was born in Allentown, Pennsylvania. It's the third largest city in Pennsylvania, in the heart of the Lehigh Valley region.
Yeah.
And grew up, I don't know what the average age for anyone who, sort of gets intensely engaged in public policy and political life is. For me, kind of by 11th or 12th grade, I started to find intriguing, and from there, the depth of engagement and fascination and involvement has deepened so considerably with each passing year, and it's always interesting the way things like that develop. But yes, I grew up in what's called the Rust Belt in the United States.
The Rust Belt in the U.S. Pennsylvania is a swing state, and you were in a community of the blue-collar worker, people that work in steel, manufacturers, and maybe you have been going over this again periodically, but it's a quite amazing stories of how or what drove you into politics and what shaped your political views.
I think if I took the first like through 10th or 11th grade, it's not something that really dawned on me much. I probably didn't even put a lot of focus on what I was going to be or do. I was very, very heavily and intensively engaged in sports in a real competitive region of the country, and football and wrestling especially. But track and baseball, and fitness team. I did everything, but football and wrestling in the region where I grew up are like a full-time job plus, it's intensely competitive. Even to be average at it, you got to pour everything into it. So I started, sports real early in life. I don't even, how, 7, 8 years old probably. And I don't know, there's the absolute truth about sports. A lot of parents say, definitely do it, definitely don't do it. I think it depends on the person. I have a son who I tried to get involved in sports, but mostly because it was something that I knew well and was comfortable, and I know what I derived from it. But as he got a little older, he really wasn't too into it, and I became fully appreciative of his perspective ultimately. Which if you had told me, I would come to understand. I would have argued with you, because for me, my character, the fortitude, strength, confidence, boldness, all the qualities, leadership skills, probably, came out of, by necessity, having to have those to be able to compete. And most of the people I know who I played with, had similar experiences, and some have gone on to use that to do some really extraordinarily great things, and some have used those skill sets to do some incredibly stupid and negative things. But so that's kind of like the early part of my life, and academically, like in high school, unlike college, in high school, the one thing I learned is just like observing how different kids learn differently. And I got to be honest. I mean, everyone says, "Well, who's your favorite high school teacher? Who influenced you the most?" No, none of them really. Yeah, I cited my wrestling coach a few times, but it sort of necessity. None of them really did, and it was a frustration of mine, in a way. But importantly, and relevant to what we're going to talk about today, I start getting into like maybe the second half of 11th grade in the United States. You got to start. Are we letting people know where you are, or is that covert?
Yeah.
Are we able to say or no?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. So I had to start applying for colleges, and I had I was really good in wrestling, and if you're really good, like in the region where I was, you're going to be exceptional in some of these other areas in the country. So I had a lot of interest and scholarship potential, but kind of in the 12th grade, I started thinking like, well, where's that all going to go? I'm going to spend 4 years doing it. I know how much work's involved. You have to like lose weight. You're constantly training. To this day, you talk to people, and as Bruce Springsteen sang the song "Glory Days," right? You ever hear it? Yeah, it's kind of it's no one wants to hear your old sports stories. People live in the present tense.
Yeah.
So I kind of concluded that it was probably not the best allocation of the next 4 years, though it was clearly an option, and who knows how far I would have gone with it. But I ended up attending the University of Miami, Coral Gables, Florida. Totally night and day as far as where I grew up, a very different environment. So I'm growing up in the 1980s in Pennsylvania while Bethlehem Steel's closing down, we're going through recessions. Reagan's taking office, and the economy's beginning to improve in a lot of areas in the country, but not where I grew up. There was a lot of insecurity, a lot of with jobs, a lot of routine closures, and a lot of anxiety, and from everyone. Like, I had a few friends who might have had dads who were like CEOs of companies or physicians or something that wasn't affected, but for the most part, everybody's parents were going through these constant battles as it related to the stability of their lives and their income. Then I get down to University of Miami, and of course I'd been to South Florida before, but I just noticed the culture there was so much more optimistic. It was entrepreneurial. It was positive. Everyone was optimistic. And I don't know if it was the time, the period, but it always seems to me that whenever I go back down there, I end up feeling reinvigorated because there's just a sense of possibility in Miami. So I guess it's a love-hate city. I mean, there's people who absolutely hate it, but I would say I've lived all over the country, and I've been all over the world, and it's one of the great cities, that I've ever gone to. And so by this time I've read a few political books, and I was troubled by what I saw in Pennsylvania and the experience with the Rust Belt. I felt very simplistically, not that I'd thought everything through, but I'm like, somebody really should be doing something. And that ultimately got me to ask, well, who? Well, I kind of thought government should be doing something, and government should be addressing these problems, not just allowing this to happen. I get down there and I start to become involved, college Republicans, and friendships develop, and predominantly with a lot of Cuban Americans, because they were then, less so now, I must say, but then they were very uh, largely anti-communist, pro
They were.
Reagan, and conservative. Though,
Yeah.
but even then, you could see that there was a generational churn where they were mostly second generation Cubans. It was their parents who had fled after the 1959 Castro Revolution. And so they either felt really passionately about the things that happened to their parents that they may have witnessed as kids, or they were told about it. But my friends were kind of on that anti-communist, anti-Castro side, and I really found this, in a life of, so far, that's been filled with just a whole bunch of diverse experiences. This was kind of one of the first times I was talking with people whose upbringing was so wholly different than my own. But maybe not completely, because what I ultimately concluded was here was another problem, right? Macro level, that somebody should be doing something about, and nobody was. No one was really. I mean, I read a book on the Bay of Pigs. I educated myself on that. I educated myself on the Cuban Missile Crisis. But mostly I inquired with them, and I spoke with their parents as well about, the land they lost, that they'd spent generations acquiring, the human rights abuses, the jailings, and ultimately the loss of a country, which for an American is not something that we, even to this day, fully grasp. The anxiety that goes through that, meaning, yeah, you can move to another country, but you're sort of always a stranger in another country in a way, right? I mean, you're there out of necessity, not usually by choice. And that was kind of like, they all loved America and they loved being there. Most of them, were very successful there, and even some of them more successful in the United States than in Cuba. But if you had asked them, they wanted to go back, and they lived and so I had the introduction kind of to this broad community, really, of the culture of Calle Ocho, and
Carlucho.
yeah, and it was just kind of a centerpiece of it all in the 80s and down there. And I quickly said, well, I became like an anti-communist, basically. And then from there, you kind of logically thought it through, and I said, and, I'm pro-Reagan, because Democrats were, at that time, even though now they say the Cold War was a simple time, no, they were on the other side of things, fighting us every step of the way. They were not anti-communist largely. Some were, but mostly the party was trying to accommodate, appease, kind of in Neville Chamberlain-like ways, the communist regimes of the world, including Cuba. And there was an active measure, even back then, to lift sanctions against Cuba, to recognize Cuba. So I got involved, and I was president of College Republicans. In one of the first real exposures, I went out with the Nicaraguan Contras, January 1984, out to the base camps, and that began a real long level of involvement in my support, really ultimately championing both the theoretical and operational side of the Reagan Doctrine.
You were in your 20s. How come
Well,
you left the comfortability of your hometown or the job you might have get in the U.S. and you moved?
if I hadn't gone to Miami.
A hell. Sorry for using that word. A hell conflict in Nicaragua when thousands of people were shot and killed for more 30 years before I was born. And how do you saw the complexity of the fight that was happening there, and why was it danger to the U.S.?
Well, this was what they call a campesino army that had been assembled. And I really tried to, obviously I I went out with the leadership of the Contras. So, Enrique Bermudez was the military commander. I got to know him quite well. I actually wrote his biographical article because his English wasn't particularly good. He, of course, as you know, was later assassinated by a sniper in Managua. I think the Sandinistas did invite him to some meeting, and then the meeting was canceled, but it was all a setup, an assassination setup. I had a lot of these experiences through the whole dangerous experiences and fatal ones throughout the whole process. And then Adolfo Calero, who now I'm not really, he had been like a Coca-Cola executive under Somoza, I think. They had totally different backgrounds. And Bermudez had been in the Somoza's National Guard, which had a bad reputation. But the lesson to take away from the 1979 revolution in Nicaragua was Carter's mismanagement of it. It became so crystal clear. 1979 was a very bad year in American foreign policy. We had Carter looks at Nicaragua, says Somoza is violating human rights. We're going to cut off our support for him. He didn't think two chess moves ahead, just one. So he cuts off the support, and we're engaged in a global Cold War conflict with the Soviet Union actively looking for opportunities to expand, and Cuba looking for active ways to expand its influence. And we kind of opened the door for both of them to come in, support the Sandinista revolution. They take power just like Castro did, with lies, misrepresentations, drawing on the insecurities and struggles of the people with all sorts of promises they never delivered on. Never held free and fair elections, never developed an accountable government, were more corrupt even than the regime they replaced. Disparities of income that they decried actually grew, with the elite communist regime living very high and the poor of Nicaragua getting poorer. And the human rights, which is most important, I think, for this, is the consideration that led the U.S. government under Jimmy Carter to stop supporting Anastasio Somoza, an ally, or not an ally, but a friendly government, an imperfect friend, actually worsens. So in the name of human rights gets worse in Nicaragua. Then you look in Iran the same year, 1979. Carter looks at the Shah of Iran, sees the same thing. I don't like these human rights abuses, and we're providing them with aid. I will just cut off the aid. Cuts off the aid, again, not thinking about the power vacuum he's creating. The Shah is pretty quickly deprived of and removed by the Iranian Revolution, the Ayatollah, the mullahs, who are now, a leading nuclear power developing, largest state sponsor of terror, vocal enemy of the United States of America and almost every Western democracy, and, like Nicaragua, a worse abuser of human rights than the Shah. And then, of course, 1979, on the topic that everyone's heard a lot about over the last 2 weeks, Afghanistan, the Soviets look at Carter kind of the way I think China looks at Biden, as being weak, not willing to stand up to them, and they see an opportunity and maybe a window closing if he's not reelected, and they launch the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. And Afghanistan, of course, has been under, conflict internally in that country for its entire modern existence. The British, Soviets, the Taliban, the housing of Al-Qaeda, the U.S. engagement in October of 2001, a month after 9/11, and now, this unbelievably despicable development. So all of that develops, and I start to kind of put all these pieces together, formulate, so I develop quickly. I do a couple internships in Washington, D.C. That I always like to plug for younger conservatives. One is with the National Journalism Center, which is for, individuals that are looking to kind of develop as journalists or writers, mostly as journalists, and are either centrist or center right in their political outlook. Because, as you know, in 2 decades, we've had complete collapse of almost every major institution in this country to the left, and we're a country like a lot of countries that have gone through revolutions of this nature, like Venezuela, like Cuba, like Nicaragua. We're kind of in denial. You know what I mean? We're not.
Yes, that my understanding is the conflicts in Latin America, saying Cuba and Venezuela and so on, has been established as a second priority by the permanent bureaucracy of the U.S. establishment. The understanding we have is that the U.S. doesn't focus too much in the Western Hemisphere situation. And Cuba happened like 60 years ago, but let's go just a few years ago in Venezuela, we are talking of 5 million refugees, and it's a huge crisis. People are actually dying for lack of food, and they are being shot by the regime, by the repressive forces of the Maduro's regime, which is not acting alone. Technically, we know that there are direct
Russians are on the ground, Cubans are on the ground.
Yeah, Iranians.
I think the way I described it,
it's a direct fly. I don't know if it's still operating, but there was a direct fly from Tehran to Havana and to Caracas. And why would Iran would place an aircraft just for doing that routing, what they are carrying in and out? So it's quite interesting, the situation. And all that has happened under either Republican or Democratic alike. Democrat president, I'm saying, has been under your watch, and it's a situation that we are used to see, that we have to deal with it. I think we cannot keep ignoring, but it's just a proposition of mentioning an issue that has been going around for a while now. Just a question, Michael, because we move too forward on the time schedule, in chronological events. Yeah. You went to Nicaragua and you were involved in the Ronald Reagan, but after that you were speechwriter of George Bush, of George Herbert Walker Bush. And my understanding of the situation is that the U.S. back then in 1988, 1992 wouldn't be in a better position. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The 1991, I remember. I was 2-3 years, but I remember very well. The international coalition led by the U.S. had decisively defeated Saddam Hussein and the Gulf War. And I wonder what went wrong.
Bush's popularity was over 90%.
Incredibly high. Incredibly. Yeah. Not even his son after 9/11 probably was so popular as his father was.
There's been no president since has had popularity that high.
Yeah. What happened then? How come he just was one-term president?
Well, a few things happened. Number one was American politics, the way it's structured, can often get oversimplified, meaning you look at it and you say, well, we lost to the Democrats. But one of the challenges in the Bush administration was the American people grow impatient with one party after a series of terms. And so we had Reagan gets elected in November 1980, completely reverses the weakness of the country under Carter. So I talked about Nicaragua, Iran, the Iranian hostage crisis happens on his watch. We had the stagflation in the country, which is both high unemployment and high inflation. The gas lines. Most younger Americans weren't even alive for that, and I was young myself. But it just everything was going poorly. And Reagan was a kind of, clearly an actor, but he had been a governor in California, and he'd been enormously successful in the lecture circuit. You can hear some of his speeches before he became president. I mean, they're just definitely worth listening to. You could tell he put a lot of focus on it, and he gave a lot of thought to the country's ailments. And he concluded early on, before he actually wins the presidency in November 1980, and of course he lost in one race before then, that the Soviet Union was not being addressed forcefully enough. That we were not describing it accurately, that it was an evil empire, as he iconically ultimately labeled it in a series of speeches. It was evil, and therefore, this was not a traditional, geostrategic struggle for the upper hand that the world has seen throughout the history of man. This was literally a struggle between good and evil, and many of us, me included, supported that definition of it because that's the way I saw it. And I had been to the Soviet Union by then, and I had just abundant numbers of firsthand observations and stories of what the Soviets were doing in pursuit of Lenin's 1917 Bolshevik vision for their development. And of course, they were, and still are, as Russia, a nuclear power. So we were constantly engaged in that debate. Democrats and liberals wanted to have what was a nuclear freeze. They felt the development of weapons was what was threatening. As we try to explain, that peace could only be protected by the strength of the country. And then ultimately, one of the Reagan Doctrine kind of starts to formulate, at least in Afghanistan, after this invasion in '79, with support for the Mujahideen, broad number of factions within it, a lot of complexities. But by the time I get to DC, I'm now, at least for being still a kid, really in my 20s, I'm giving a lot of thought to this whole thing, and I start to think through and develop a thesis, and with a number of other people who help refine it and offer their input. And I just end up describing it in a way that I think it needs to be looked at historically, that there were three essentially tyrannical colonies of the Soviet Union. Number one was they went out and developed all these external client states in Asia and Africa. I went out with the UNITA forces in Angola, where the Cubans were, as you know. Yeah. And where the Soviets were putting, I think, $1.5 billion, one fiscal year in military aid into it, and in Latin America and the Caribbean, and seeking really to alter the balance of power in the world, away from freedom, away from democracy, human rights, capitalism, and toward this central control. And they were having success because all of the consecutive presidents, were probably indisputably anti-communist and were aware of the threat, but none had really developed any coherent plan aside from what was called containment and mutually assured destruction. Meaning, yes, it's true, you can decimate the United States with a nuclear attack, but we will launch, simultaneously a responsive attack, and we'll destroy your country too. It made no sense. So, it was an incredible moment. I worked then with some really bright minds, some real iconically recognizable people who've gone on to do really good things and who I'm honored to still know. And we started to think through this stuff, so we developed the Strategic Defense Initiative in a conservative movement, which was the idea that why do we need to live under this mutual assured destruction? Let's shoot these nuclear weapons out of the sky if they launch them, right? And there was the technology that was beginning to emerge for us to do that. And the Soviets were very threatened by it. That was why Reagan walked out of Reykjavik in that summit. And then on the Reagan Doctrine, I started to describe, as I was saying, these three basically colonial, tyrannical empires that they established. One is the external world of Nicaragua, Cuba, Angola, Afghanistan, Cambodia, Vietnam, North Korea, that was then allied with them. And in all those cases, those people were not communists. They did not support or want the Soviets involved there. They were going against what I would say was human nature even, It wasn't even a debate. It was just unnatural. And then you had, of course, after World War II, in the management between the Allied forces, let's face it, sort of the surrender of Central and Eastern Europe, which creates the Warsaw Pact of, so East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, all of these countries that are forced under this communist regime, that they are the same way. It's not natural to them. It's not what they want. Some of the Budapest, Prague, these were some of the great historical, educated, liberal cities of the world before that period, and they too resisted it. In Poland with Lech Walesa, and then you had the third colony, which no one really thought of it in these terms, but the Soviet Union itself was a colony. I mean, it was not one single country. You had, the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. They would have broken away if they had the option or given a referendum or a right to vote on it. Ukraine, Georgia, the Central Asian republics, all of them just held together by force by the Red Army and this, brutal regime that Lenin created and Stalin perfected as a killing machine, really.
Yeah.
And I said, and collectively, many of us argued that this Reagan Doctrine is not just simply one of defending the United States. It's not simply one of meeting the obligation of helping people who want to put their lives on the line and fight for freedom. It's more than that, because if we can get one victory out of any one of what were well over half a dozen major third developing world conflicts at the time, it's going to shatter the invincibility of the Soviet Union. And people will realize that it's not an inevitability that they have to live the rest of their lives under that system. And so the Soviets, after invading Afghanistan in 1979, are driven out in 1989. Mixed results elsewhere. The Cubans are ultimately driven out of Angola because of Savimbi's resistance, but the communist regime there is reluctant to hold elections, rigs the elections, Savimbi disputes it. Nicaragua, Violeta Chamorro is elected. It looks like things have gone well. Cuba, Castro ages, and I'll tell you, when I first described those early days of life in Miami, we would think there was broad perception then that Castro's fall could happen any day now. You know what I mean? And I think I remember it might have been even watching Reagan's funeral and realizing that because Fidel Castro, I think, outlived Reagan. I'm like, Castro is still alive and running Cuba, and Reagan's dead. We never would have envisioned that it's not even Castro, but Fidel and Raul, that they would both have that level of durability, because we knew, even while most of the most vehement anti-communists had fled after the revolution, the base of support wasn't there. The economy was collapsing. They were isolated. And we could talk some more about that. But anyway, Afghanistan drives, we support the Mujahideen. Ahmad Shah Massoud is, the so-called Lion of Panjshir, I start to point out as one of the better hopes in Afghanistan, because there were some bad guys opposing the Soviets too, including bin Laden. A lot of people have forgotten that he was, involved in the anti-Soviet conflict. But he's what we call the Arab Mujahideen, meaning he had no historical tie to Afghanistan. He was born in Riyadh, born to a billionaire father who ran a multinational construction company that got contracts off of, political leverage and, goes into a very hardened Islamic state. Large family. They didn't all go that way. Most came to disown him, actually. Yeah.
And there is something. 9/11 happens, and my question is, did anyone saw this coming? How come Osama bin Laden, which was a former...
Yeah, so before, just chronologically, so what I'm saying in Washington, D.C. at this time is we're going to win one of these conflicts, because finally we made the argument. I mean, I came back from these regions and talked about the struggles that were going on, talked about these people that were putting their lives on the line, and how in the world are we just going to allow them to be mowed down by Soviet-supported tyranny? And that argument, it's sold on a limited basis as a means of self-defense, meaning, we'll bog these regimes down in conflict and maybe they won't invade other countries. Because remember, like in Nicaragua, perfect example, there was a lot of concern that they would, they were supporting the FMLN in El Salvador and undermining the government there. They were trying to undermine the governments in Guatemala, Honduras, and Costa Rica. They had their own, regional expansion, and Cuba and the DGI, their intelligence division in Cuba, very much were engaged in all of these things. They were involved in drug running and funding a lot of it with profits from narcotic sales. A lot of things, and obviously inviting the Russians in to build all sorts of military infrastructure within Cuba. So the message that I'm sending, in essence, is don't underestimate what even one victory could mean. And that victory, the mixed results in these conflicts, but in Afghanistan, it becomes a really glaring, indisputable, clear-cut victory where Gorbachev ultimately labels the occupation of Afghanistan a bleeding wound, and in 1989 makes the decision to withdraw the troops, and the Reagan Doctrine has successfully liberated Afghanistan from Soviet control. And the series of events that I had described, that this would not just have ramifications in the country where it happened, but the world would witness this and see the Soviet Union not as a paper tiger, but as not the invincible, necessity that we just had to live with. They would see the possibility that existed with the collapse of this entire system. And the world watched Soviet tanks roll out of Kabul, defeated. We shot jets out of the air. This was a tribal conflict, where we had trained individuals with largely no military training, and heat-seeking missiles and how to shoot down aircraft, and they beat the Red Army for all sorts of reasons. And the world, so from Moscow to Budapest to East Berlin to Managua to Havana, everyone sees that this has happened. And you start to see that the resistance picks up. And the intensity and the planning, the organization, the optimism inspires a renewed vigor in what already was mass opposition to the system, including within the Soviet Union. the Baltic states start, saying, yeah, we really want independence. They start being more vocal about it, where they were afraid originally to do this.
And
And so,
they
and
lost
so
their sons.
you can read, there's 1,000 books that have been written about the end of the Cold War. And usually academics and these professors who haven't been to these places, haven't talked usually to the people involved, know the least about it. And I saw this firsthand with the Tea Party movement. There's 100 books written on the Tea Party movement by people no one in the Tea Party movement I know of has ever spoken with. But so this is not really the conventional explanation. I mean, the more conventional explanation was that they faced financial pressures and ultimately a series of the perfect storm occurs and they reluctantly give it up. But not my thesis. If the Soviets had prevailed and beaten down the Afghan people and expanded their empire in Central Asia and Afghanistan,
they will be there probably by now.
Yeah, maybe it would have ended by now, but maybe it would have been a 500-year reign. Who knows? I believe that the Reagan Doctrine and the force that really an incredibly small number of people brought to bear in Washington, D.C. changed the course of history in a very significant way. Now, we haven't seized on the opportunities that should have brought, because when you look at the end of the Cold War, you get, Francis Fukuyama writes the big article, The End of History, and basically this is so dramatic that we will never again have war or conflict. That's proven obviously inaccurate. There's, this thesis among some of the intelligentsia that liberal market economies have finally prevailed and will represent the global future, and it's the end of tyranny. And the world never quite fits into that cute little box that the most hardened ideologues or intellectuals want to put it in. It's always a mixed bag and much more complex. And then we end up with you were up to Bush, loses 1992, and Clinton really, I don't doubt his, I don't think, I really have concerns about what's motivating Joe Biden. I think Bill Clinton wanted to do the right thing, but he had no experience in any of these matters. He never worked in a national security or foreign policy capacity. And he ignores big parts of the world. And that is, to get to your point on 9/11, so the Taliban, the Soviets were driven out of Afghanistan, and we just stopped paying attention to Afghanistan completely, go back to normal life. And while we're not paying attention, while we're not involved, these hardened Islamic radicals begin to organize the Taliban. They take over the government. They take over the government with an ideological agenda of harboring terrorist elements, including Al-Qaeda, led then by bin Laden. And bin Laden, finally in the Saudis, part ways with him. He moves to Sudan. We had him on satellite imaging. He could have been taken out by Clinton before 9/11. They decide it's too risky or not worth it, probably, almost certainly because they don't envision the magnitude of destruction this man was going to inflict on the United States. And of course, any of it would have been permissible or would have inevitably developed if you didn't have the Taliban working in providing them with the protection to start the planning that ultimately leads to 9/11. So the Taliban, same movement that now claims control of Afghanistan, as we come up on the 20th anniversary here in about a week and a half, is
to point out that the retreat of the Soviet Union from Afghanistan was pretty much organized. They took away every single piece of gear and army that they had.
I could go on with this, because it's not, while Afghanistan is maybe the most glaring example, and it's an important example because there were individuals in the government, and you can read this read the 9/11 report. It's worth, you really should read it, and it's a good read for the government report. It's not a bad read. There are individuals who are desperately jumping up and down, shouting about this emerging threat. You at one point have an FBI agent in Chicago working counterterrorism measures who I think uses the phrase "all lights were flashing red." You know, was how dramatic it was. And Ahmad Shah Massoud famously mostly spends his time up in the Panjshir Valley in northern Afghanistan, but does come out to visit Western Europe and the United States. And his message is so important to even digest today. And Ahmad Shah Massoud is someone Americans don't know. I don't think most people in the world know, but it's worth reading about him. He was a military resistance leader who had a broad range of leadership characteristics and skills, and was a nice man on top of it all. I mean, it's tough to find people who can defeat a superpower militarily and are nice people with good intentions. But he always wanted a decentralized government in Afghanistan. He understood that there was a diverse population, that you couldn't have a top-down heavy approach that both Islamic extremist governments typically have and the communist regimes have. But he says, look, if something, when we would say, what is the magnitude of threat that Al-Qaeda represents to the United States? No one even knew in the United States, most people didn't even know what Al-Qaeda was, but for those of us who are foreign policy experts, I mean, we knew very well, and I particularly knew well, because one of the challenges in putting the Reagan Doctrine together was making sure that Pakistan was not redirecting aid to this guy named Osama bin Laden, who we knew during the 80s was they're from Saudi Arabia and had these very extreme Islamic viewpoints that if he had prevailed would, we thought, be detrimental to Afghanistan. I don't think any of us envisioned that it would have broader ramifications outside of Afghanistan, but for those reasons alone, so you'll hear critics of Reagan Doctrine, and you'll hear even people on 9/11 say that we funded Al-Qaeda. And I just want to be clear about that.
No.
It's complicated because on a leadership basis, every measure was taken to make sure that no aid got to Al-Qaeda. The problem was, because of the mountainous terrain of Afghanistan, this aid had come in from Pakistan. It would usually come in on top of, literally on top of horses and donkeys. That's how we would bring it in, because you couldn't get through this really rugged terrain on vehicles. You couldn't do it that way. So you had to rely on Pakistan's intelligence service, who understood that and had the regional force. We couldn't have a whole bunch of Americans running around over there for a whole bunch of reasons. One, it was a covert project. Two, it would have put Americans in direct harm, and that was the genius of the Reagan Doctrine, is that we were confronting the Soviet Union without putting Americans into direct harm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the ISI, which is the intelligence division in Pakistan, and it's still in existence, gains favor with Al-Qaeda, with what ultimately becomes Taliban, and they do actually redirect a lot of American aid. And we had, the United States government had, and even those of us involved in support of the Reagan Doctrine had many confrontational discussions with Pakistan's military and with their intelligence divisions about the fact that we documentably knew that they were diverting this aid and lying about it. And that was where there started to be some tension between Islamabad and Washington in the bilateral relationship. And it was curious because it really did make, like it made, you had to understand really Pakistan's perspective on it. And without, so in essence, there's some truth to the fact that he does end up being a beneficiary of this conflict, but not by just no conscious involvement in the United States to do it, just the opposite, conscious decisions that we were making, doing everything possible to ensure that it did not happen. But everything possible was not all things possible. It was subject to the limitations of a remote war and relying on a third party that was ultimately not routinely reliable.
Yeah.
But importantly, they're driven out, and I really, my thesis, which I think, and there've been articles and books written in support of this thesis, this sets off a chain of events throughout the world that ultimately leads to the Berlin Wall's collapse, Soviet Union's dissolution, and the formal ending of the Cold War, and Bush 41, many legacies and some things he didn't do well, but two things he did do exceptionally well. One was the first Gulf War. Iraq invades Kuwait. That was one of the first challenges to kind of this global order that he envisioned from his time of many decades in many capacities in government service, including at the CIA, and says, this cannot stand, his exact phrase, and will not stand. And we execute a very almost flawless military campaign, drive the Iraqis out of there. I went to Kuwait right after the liberation. I literally took magazine cartridges from Iraqi machine guns outside of tanks that were all across the desert. I mean, you really had to see this, and somewhere I have photos that I took of it. But there were these blown out tanks that were in retreat that we decimated as they tried to navigate their way out of Kuwait through the desert back into Iraq. That's one. And then two, of course, as the unfolding of this Gorbachev's control on it, his inability to control their overextension of their power with the Afghan collapse, and then the pressure being exerted in Angola, where he's frantically trying to put more and more aid in. And when he talks about it as a bleeding wound, I think what he meant to say in Russian by that was that it's like you try to replenish what you've lost, and then you lose even more. So it's like a bad night of blackjack or something. When you say you're going to win back your losings, and then you double your losings. That's what was happening essentially, because they had nothing going. They had the invincibility of their capture of these regions was shattered. Their system was not leaving people happy, and it was totally dysfunctional. It did not operate. And so what's important to emphasize, though, just to bring the Bush era to a close, is it would have been so easy, knowing the influence that the GRU and the Red Army and generals, many of whom were older and dated back into glory days. I'm raising the fact that as they were collapsing, for them to have launched an intermediate or long-term attack on us, that was a real possibility. And the extraordinary diplomatic navigation that, so I always say it was Reagan, and the Reagan Doctrine brings the Soviet Union down, but bringing them down was also dangerous, because it really took the sophistication and diplomatic skill that Bush 41 had that allowed their collapse to not be also painful to the world or to spark even a global conflict.
Yeah. But then happened 9/11, and I think one fair question here is like, you know what is happening right now with the Kabul, the Taliban taking over again after 20 years, but everything goes back to 2001. What the Bush, I mean, George Walker Bush, the son, what Bush administration got right and what they got wrong about the war on terror. Was a mistake to go to Afghanistan, Iraq after all?
The way you're phrasing that question perfectly, you're exactly right. You have to look at both sides of it because there are elements that we've focused on in this state of national turmoil and sadness and mourning, where the country clearly did rally around the president. But to be objective about it, it was just tough in American politics because, you know, like for someone like me who worked for one of the Bushes, you know, there's kind of a secret code. Hey, don't criticize any of the Bushes. But, you know, my approach is, you know, look, perfection is a tough thing for anyone to obtain. You know, even Reagan wasn't perfect. Trump was, you know, as much as I was usually enthusiastic, not perfect. Bush 40, you have to start with the fact that, you know, Robert Wright Jr. is the one of many individuals within he was with the FBI in Chicago. You know, he starts issuing these red alarm warnings that are funneling through the National Security Council. So they're in the White House. He writes one famous memo 3 months prior to 9/11. Says, until the investigative responsibilities for terrorism are removed from the FBI, I will not feel safe. What a bold statement by a professional FBI agent. And he ends up being demoted 2002 after 9/11, which we've subsequently discovered. This is important because I think, you know, we talk now openly about a deep state and a bureaucracy that operates in curious, sometimes inexplicable ways. This is really the first time you see it manifest. So here's a patriot and an FBI agent trying to navigate the monstrosity of this large federal bureaucracy and to inform the leader of the free world that we have a major imminent threat. And then, of course, Robert Wright, like myself, is aware of the Ahmad Shah Massoud angle, that Massoud studied conclusion, knowing al-Qaeda better than either of us did, that if something happened to him, we needed to be concerned. That was almost his exact quote from Ahmad Shah Massoud. And then, so on September 9th, 48 hours before 9/11, you know, two al-Qaeda operatives posing as journalists show up in the Panjshir Valley, you know, which is, it's a long trek to get there, and detonate these explosive devices in suicide bombing and kill Ahmad Shah Massoud. And then 48 hours, we have the launch of a series of air attacks on some of the most iconic and critically important financial and political building structures in our country.
And the world, in fact.
And the world, yeah.
Just to finish in, because it's been amazing, and I mean, I was not prepared for the encyclopedic explanation that you have given to me for the Cold War and all this. But now in 2021, we have a situation in the United States.
We got a big problem.
Atypical, I would try to be polite. Atypical. I have seen in the news multiple crises, border crisis, energetic crisis, inflation. And on top of that happens the retreat of Afghanistan, which is quite sad, for saying the right word about it. And the question is, after 7 months of the Biden administration, is there something positive about the Biden administration at this point, and where are we going with this?
Say that again. Is there something what?
There's something positive to remark.
Positive.
Biden
No.
administration.
It's a universal, colossal disaster of a man who's not suited or qualified and has no significant accomplishment to his name in half a century of high-level government service as vice president and senator before this, who may or may not have won the November 3 election. I mean, that's why that's why we want these 6 audits. There's enough anecdotal information, but it's like investigating a crime. I mean, you don't really know until you conclude the investigation, which of course they're trying to obstruct. They're trying to marginalize. They don't want people talking about, thinking about, and it's weird because I mean, I've studied the Navarro reports. I've spoken with whistleblowers. I've read affidavits. And I've been involved in politics now, all the way back to where we began this conversation. So many races I've been involved in, federally, presidential, congressional, state level, local. This is the first time in my whole life where I have not felt, even having been on the losing side many times, where I felt I'm not sure that I can say with absolute certainty that that this election should have been certified. And that might sound outrageous, but it's not if you know the details, because that's exactly what these state legislators, now that they're looking at it finally, in Maricopa County in Arizona, in Georgia, in Pennsylvania and Harrisburg, and I think soon in Michigan and Wisconsin, and Nevada's the other state, final state. Some of these are indisputable facts, like individuals voting from out of state. Why have we not gone back in and adjusted the popular vote to remove them? Why have we not held the people who violated our federal election laws accountable? I'm not saying that I don't know what the criminal penalty is for that. I should probably find out. I assume it's minimal. That probably is not a available offense, but it's more serious than a speeding citation in your car or something. We've been no effort to hold these people accountable. They circumvented the state legislative process, didn't hold that accountable, but and many other things. So all of that creates this aura of mystery about your question of what's going on with this guy. He's clearly not well health-wise, because that's the downside when you've been in the public domain that long. We saw, you saw him as vice president. I didn't think he was effective then, but he was intellectually and mentally night and day to what he is now. He's clearly struggling to literally get through the day, much less to manage the most difficult and demanding job in the world. But that's not, in my view, what's happening. All right. So you have 2 schools of thought. Let's just quickly summarize Afghanistan. So, a series of baffling decisions. Back in April, I've come to learn a series of decisions are made to cease paying the Afghan military in the way that we historically been doing it, to pay it through the central government. And that leads many of these individuals, both in administrative governmental positions and in the military, have told me, and I have message after message about this, that they hadn't been paid since April. So that's demoralizing. Then importantly, this very critical base that we construct in the 1950s as part of the Cold War strategy. It's ultimately taken over by the Soviets during their occupation in the 80s, and then by the Taliban, and then we reclaim it. We invest tens of millions of dollars more in upgrading it. Could be a very, very vital centerpiece of a forward strategy that offers a defense mechanism in that crucially and increasingly volatile region of the world, with China's Communist Party now looking to expand. If I were president or in a national security advising capacity, I would make the argument to hold on to that base, just like we have bases in the Pacific and all over the world in strategic areas. That we invested in it, we built it, it was ours. What does he do? Not only doesn't he keep it, he doesn't even do the traditional sort of drawdown and ceremonial handing off. In the middle of the night, with no announcement to any to anyone in the Afghan government, including, by the way, the Afghan military stationed at that base, literally wake up the next day and the Americans are gone. Wow. And we've left all this equipment behind, which, is ultimately, civilian vandals.
85
billion total. But who knows? But, and I'll tell you, this video now emerging, I mean, you've got automatic weapons. I mean, and this is what I wanted. So the air base, that's July 2nd, I believe, or right before July 4th holiday. Then you look at the actual way the departure itself is handled. First, we impose this artificial deadline on ourselves. Why would we box ourselves in? Even if you want to have a deadline, keep it internally as a guideline, but it's got to be just a guideline. The situation on the ground needs to dictate what happens. You don't say, hey, we're out of time and we just got to leave a few hundred Americans behind. In fact, the first thing you do is you get unarmed civilians that are there in humanitarian or business or other capacities out of the country before you start downgrading the military capacity is the last thing you do. Every part of this was done inaccurately. So one thesis is that even though I do ideologically disagree with the mindset of the national security foreign policy team of this administration, you buy into the argument that these highly professional, well-educated, very experienced, and competent within the constraints of their misguided ideas, but on an operational basis, you would have to believe that, 50 or maybe more high-level national security and foreign affairs and White House NSC officials all simultaneously make about 10 major, totally, indisputably bad decisions in a row. That's one thesis, and so you'll see people out there saying, "Oh, Biden's mismanaged this. He hasn't handled it well. He made mistakes." That's not my view. That's not my view, but I'm speculating. But speculation is where this begins, because this is the course, and this is why I think it's an impeachable offense. Is that we've got to get to the answers on this. I believe you cannot look at the departure and say that it was motivated predominantly by a concern for any U.S. interest in Afghanistan. You can't say it was motivated by the interest of American military and American civilians in Afghanistan. You cannot say it was motivated by any Afghan security concern, and you cannot say it was motivated by any concern about the human rights and humanitarian plight of the embattled Afghan people. It was clearly, every one of these steps was absolutely disregarding of the outcome for those factors that would traditionally be the ones you would consider on a conflict. To me, it's another factor that drives this decision. And that's also why it's done with such expeditious speed, because it may be a plan, but when you're executing in ways that aren't really explainable and that are going to prove damaging and ultimately prove deadly, as they did with our Marines and with many, many civilian lives that have been lost because of Biden's approach on this. The reality, I conclude, is there's a factor X that had nothing to do with Afghanistan that was the underlying basis for the decisions that were made, that I believe were made a long time ago, probably all the way back to the inauguration or maybe even during the transition period. And so did the Biden plan fail? No, in my view, the Biden plan has succeeded because the Biden plan, for whatever reason that we need to find out, was to collapse the Afghan government, to collapse the Afghan military, to surrender the very strategic air base that we had poured extraordinary sums of money into that could be so hugely important in containing aggressions in that area, and to be disregarding of the humanitarian impact, even to the point of being disregarding of the threat of the lives
Well, yeah,
of
they
people
are
we were
saying,
leaving in. So literally right now, even with American military now gone and us having turned over the Kabul International Airport, which by the way is a one-strip airline. I mean, this is not an international airport in the traditional sense. It's got one, airstrip, and its capacity limitations are immense, which is another reason that deadline made no sense. You have to conclude that it was some other force. Now, so what would those theories be? Here's the one that makes most sense to me. The Belt and Road Initiative Xi Jinping puts into place, which is a terrifying plan, but only terrifying if you study up on it. Like if you just read a summary of it, your eyes will glaze over. But this is really a plan that's designed to monopolize and take away, not just from the United States, but from just about every country in the West, significant access to key trade routes throughout the world, a large portion of the world. Now, a big part of that is this vision that they're going to build transport and supply chain routes that allow the transport of goods through China, ultimately through Afghanistan, and kind of one of the stages in this would be the development of this major superhighway between Kabul and Peshawar, Pakistan. Now, I know for a fact with my engagement on Afghanistan, my contacts there, that China was already putting pressure on the Afghan democratically elected president to agree and to participate in this. But he was also being pressured by the U.S., who quite understandably said, hey, look, we've just spent $5-7 trillion liberating this country and trying to build, the possibility of a future. We lost 2,400 ballpark KIAs, some of our best people, and we didn't do all of this. So you could turn around and turn into a China Communist Party CCP client state. So he's kind of torn, and that might have been even a factor in his departure. I mean, I think there were pressures on him from both sides, and he was conflicted on how to handle it. But you follow this constitution that I described, and it clearly provides for what should be done. So the first vice president now, who is in the Panjshir Valley, who you may have noticed has retweeted me twice since the fall of Kabul. So I think, and I'm saying that not to say, oh, gee, I'm so smart on this, but there's such a deficit of thinking on it by even people who've spent their whole life.
I mean, if they truly don't know what they are doing, just hire better experts. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, but the problem is that, and this is the problem with what Trump called the swamp, right? Washington, D.C., is that what drives all these institutions is money, ultimately. Now, in my time there, no one ever told me ever once what to say or write, and they knew my positions long before I got there. But, I kind of was creative, and I developed ones while I was there, never had any resistance. But increasingly, there's a lot of view that the conservative movement in the United States and the Republican Party have become what Marxists call controlled opposition, right? So you'll see like the mullahs in Iran will do this. I believe Daniel Ortega did it in Nicaragua, Venezuelans, Castro. They'll build up the perception of an opposition that's not real opposition.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, whether it's completely bought and sold or whether they know for a fact it's just not up for the battle, they'll never deliver a win. So they're kind of like that team that plays the Harlem Globetrotters, right? Yeah. I don't know if you've ever seen that. This team, they'll go out and they'll lose 140 to 20, and every time. That's kind of where I see this movement of ours over the last 2 decades, which pains me because I put a lot into it, and a lot of people put a lot into it. But you have to be realistic about what's going on right now, and that is that on some really major issues. Let me just give you 3. I talked about November 3. That's 1. 2 would be the CCP and the role of the Wuhan Institute of Biology in the release of this pandemic on the world. Where is the force of will? Why are we sitting by while they deny us access? Still, coming up on a year since the launch of this, that we still have not gained appropriate access. They still deny the World Health Organization entry. We put Mike Pompeo and Trump put the label of genocide on there properly on the treatment of the Uyghurs.
Yeah.
No human rights group, not the United Nations,
the Arab League, no, not even the.
Some of which they are bound under national commitments to oblige.
They're not even the ISIS has released. They are very radical in the fight for Islam. Whereas when the Uyghurs, are being in a carnage in China.
And this is no game. I mean, the way I've been describing it is the genocide. I mean, is there any more serious word in the English language than genocide? I mean, you say genocide, you're talking, that's Nazi Germany, that's Pol Pot's Cambodia. I think the Serbs were labeled genocidal during the Bosnian conflict with their handling of the Muslim population. Rwanda, but there aren't many examples of it because it is, by definition, not just the abuse of an ethnic group, it's designed to eliminate an ethnic group. So all of this verbiage coming out of China and Xi Jinping, that they're responsible global partners and they believe that countries need to work together. They're not working together with anyone. They're a malicious, genocidal regime. And now would be the time when leadership needs to arise and say, look, this is not now about whether we should be participating in the Olympics. I mean, for God's sake, you're talking about 2 to 3 million people right now as we speak in forced labor camps and concentration camps, being subjected to organ harvesting, not even being given anesthesia while they extract organs and kill them for profit. That is an evil empire. Where is kind of where we were in the beginning of this conversation with the Soviet Union, in being blunt in describing this as an evil empire, which it is, and describing it, which is why I took the time to bring this full circle of describing the Soviet Union the way I did.
Yeah.
What is China ultimately? Is there a country called China? No, there's Tibet. There's South Mongolia. There's Hong Kong. There's what the Uyghurs call East Turkestan, if they had their way. Every single province in that country would break from Beijing if they were given even a referendum vote on independence. And the singular obsession of this president for life, dictator, is to minimalize and suffocate, and in the case of the Uyghurs, eradicate these ethnic identities that he believes threaten the projection of a singular form of communism over 1.4 billion people, the most populous country in the world. So when I raised all these issues as related to, to bring this to a close, the compromising of Hunter Biden, why the laptop in Delaware mattered, which was immediately I mean, you saw all that happen, how they went into very fast gear to make sure that that information was not afforded access to the American people. A significant number of individuals who went out and voted for Biden, polls show, were unaware that he had received up to $1 billion from the Bank of China in investment funds. They had received $3 million from the wife of the mayor of Moscow, one of Putin's closest aides, and that he had and been on the board of Burisma in Ukraine when he knew nothing about Ukraine, knew nothing about energy. And if he were Hunter Smith, not Hunter Biden, never would have been in the top 10,000 of considerations for that job. This clearly is a pay-to-play scheme. So when we say Joe Biden's now been there almost 50 years, and I'm sure you saw that Obama's Secretary of Defense has said he's been wrong on every major national security and foreign policy issue of the last 40 years in his autobiography. That continues to be the case, but now you start to say, is it that he's been wrong, or is it that he's sold influence, and this is just a classic Chicago-like pay-to-play scheme, and where he has traded the enrichment of his family and maybe things we don't even know about,
yes,
in exchange for decision-making that no one logically concerned about the United States and its friends around the world and liberal democracy would ever make these decisions.
Well, Michael, it was a thrill. It was an amazing pleasure to have you here with us today. I really hope that we will keep discussing this kind of things in the future, because
absolutely we will.
Need the truth to come up. The truth, know your truth, know that truth but the truth. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. And thank you for all you're doing. I am behind you, and I want to see good things for that country. And you heard me describe how influential the plight of those people have been, because realistically, would I be sitting here doing all the things that I've done? Would there be a Tea Party movement? What would have happened to the Reagan Doctrine? Like all of these things, it's kind of an interesting question. Had there not just been for the random interaction that I had there and the effect it had on me, it set off a whole series of other developments, and that's life, I guess, the way it goes. But in this case, it's definitely proven very influential to me. And I think about it a lot, because I cannot believe we're sitting here in 2021 and the same situation exists there. Even after a month ago, a little bit of promise I thought that was starting to emerge. We'll talk about that. And thank you for all you're doing, and we'll keep in touch.
Thank you.
Hasta luego.
Hasta luego.